Welcome back for another episode of Dine and Dish. And boy, it seems like the last couple shows we've had a lot of technical challenges. You can definitely tell that my aura is shutting down technology. For anybody that knows me knows that anything I'm around kind of shuts down. So we've had those issues in London with Jimmy, now today with Doug. So with further ado, we're going to get started before I shut down another platform. But my guest today is super cool, very timely in terms of what we're going to talk about since summer is coming to an end and everybody's going to ramp up in hiring. So we're going to talk employment law, hiring mistakes, and how to survive hiring for the holidays. So welcome, Doug. I can see you and hopefully I can hear you.
Good. Hopefully we straightened everything out. Good to be here.
I know. Well, I'm glad to see you and you're not frozen. So that's a good start. So welcome to Dine and Dish. And before we get started talking about your expertise and what we're going to talk about today, why don't you introduce yourself? I'm going to hand over the mic to you so you can talk a little bit about who you are, what you do, and then we'll jump right into the show.
Okay. Sounds good. So I am an employment lawyer here in Boise, Idaho. I've not always been an employment lawyer. Actually, I've only been doing this for about 4 years or so. I spent a couple of decades in the restaurant industry. I was first started off as a line cook, as people do, and then I got into catering, did a few years of catering with a partner of mine, and then eventually went back to school and got my degree. And then I stayed in the restaurant industry, opened a few restaurants for a couple of other people, and then had my own baby. I started a little restaurant up in the mountains in Stanley, Idaho, and kind of ran it, parts of the year all by myself, actually. But then, in the summer, we would bring on staff and change the menu every day, had a really great time doing it. And then eventually I got to the point where I realized that all these long hours in the kitchen were a lot for me. And things like my hands started to break down, and it seemed like time to make a change. And I thought about, do I really want to kind of go into more the management side of the restaurant and get out of the kitchen, or do I want to do something else? And the law had always interested me. So I made the bold decision to go to law school at the age of 50. Don't know if I recommend that for a lot of folks, but that's what I did. And just by happen chance, got involved in an internship in an employment law firm and found that I really liked it, and actually had kind of a lot of good experience to bear from all my years working in restaurants. So that's where I am today.
So very cool story. We kind of have a similar background because I actually started off in the law area and accounting, married into the business. My husband is the restaurateur. So I kind of took a buyout with my firm when I was working in the accounting industry, started working with him almost 20 years ago. And I keep saying every day, I'm going to go back and finish my law degree. So you're inspiring me even more. So I know you say don't do it over 50. I mean, I'm kind of in the 50s, but it's something I've been wanting to do for a really long time. So it's interesting to hear your story because you might motivate me to finally do it.
It's pretty different. I mean, I really enjoyed law school. I always have enjoyed school, but it's really interesting to be kind of confronted with people at a little different time in their lives. So I'm here. I am 57 years old, and I have friends having babies, and people getting married, and all this kind of the stuff that happens to younger folks. And I get to experience it now again. So it's kind of fun.
Did you actually attend school? Did you do it mostly online, or did you do some remote? And I guess I'm now picking your brain for a personal reason.
While I was in law school, COVID happened. So gotcha. I was in person here in Boise. And luckily, our class had a chance to gel together in person. And then we went online for a while. By the time I finished up, we were kind of back in person mostly. But it was kind of a weird time. But yeah, I mean, I really do enjoy being in person. We do have to do a
Yeah.
lot of things virtually these days, but nothing beats the one-on-one human connection.
Well, and, even from a learning perspective, I mean, there's so much more that you can do in groups and in person. And because even my daughter did her master's in accounting online, fully remotely from actually where I graduated, Michigan State. And, walking in her graduation, she was finally meeting people that she went to school with for 2, 3 years and never met them face to face because everything was always video. So what
Yeah,
a different world in terms of education. I mean, that's crazy. I mean, that's a whole nother show.
sure.
So let's jump into what we want to talk about today. And, I love your background because, it's super cool that you've had the ability to work in restaurants. So you understand the unique model of how you staff, how you hire from the front of the house to the back of the house. And I want to jump in and really talk about that because restaurants, whether you're an independent restaurateur or you're a franchisor, there's risks that you face on both sides of the coin, right? So whether it's hiring for large scale or hiring for independent, smaller level, there's definitely challenges on both sides. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about hiring challenges that you see, because I'm sure you work with a lot of restaurateurs being in this space, and what pitfalls or legal challenges that they might have if they're not smart about hiring. So why don't we jump right into that, and then we can kind of talk through what suggestions you have.
Yeah, I mean, well, in terms of hiring, there's really a lot of things to think about. A lot of restaurants hire youths. There's significant challenges with doing that, and I
Yeah.
think we'll get into that later.
Hmm.
Um, and one thing that restaurants have that other businesses don't is, um, they have tips, right? So that creates a whole level of complication to things. Um, And, it's a high pressure environment with fluctuating schedules, kind of, um, low wages typically. And it kind of creates this crucible where claims can develop. And I think that, restaurant owners need to be mindful of that and really have their house in order to begin with before they even start bringing people in, getting their systems and processes in place so that they can make good hires, so that they can have everything they need to be successful. So, you know, as far as like the hiring process goes, have job descriptions, know what the roles are that you want to hire for, and have that clear in your mind when you're going through that process. Um, and also be aware of kind of pitfalls in hiring, like, protected class status. You should never be conducting interviews asking people, about their medical conditions or their family history or really anything that could later come back and show that you were discriminating in some way.
Yeah. Well, being HR correct is, I mean, that's a given. I mean, that's a whole nother level of knowing what to ask, what not to ask during an interview, obviously, and having operation manuals in place. But there's so much more that goes into it because, like you said, a lot of restaurants do hire younger where they're under 18. I mean, here in Maryland, we try to hire over 18 just because of liquor license laws. Because, I mean, obviously there's a huge challenge that if you hire somebody under 18, they can't open liquor, they can't serve liquor. So you're definitely very challenged on what they can actually do in the restaurant. So, I mean, there's different laws for full service versus different laws for fast casual, obviously. So let's talk, since you mentioned tips, that's a big hot topic. It's funny, I'm going to digress for just a second. I do this every show. When you go to Europe, tipping is so different than the United States. And we actually just had this conversation on another show that in Europe, tips are kind of built into the menu. When you're there, it's like people typically don't tip or they'll leave $5 here, €5 here. Nobody really expects large tips. You come into the United States and it's like, Europeans travel in to visit, and their tipping mentality is very different than American mentality in terms of tipping. So, you have this challenge of tipping in general, of what the standard should be. Is it 10%? Is it 15%? Is it 20%? Good service, 25%. But now there's so much that goes into tip pooling, tip credits. So why don't you talk through, I mean, this is a hot topic in itself and probably a whole show, but why don't you, I guess, first explain what tip credits are, talk about what tip pooling is, and how that has changed in the industry from, state to state. Because I know New York, it's hot. Other countries, it's not, right? So why don't we start there?
Sure. Yeah. So
It was a loaded question, wasn't it?
yeah, it is. There's a lot there, but so basically the way it works. So tips are interesting because, you're right. In the US, tips are, part of the business model, right? So they're things that everybody has to take into account when you're running a restaurant. So because, I think this is caused by the fact that, that, a high percentage of money coming to the restaurant is going to the servers. This idea of a tip credit was instituted, right? So this is a way to pay a server less than minimum wage and take part of the tips they receive as credit toward that minimum wage and toward any overtime requirements that they might have as well. So overtime on that minimum wage. So a lot of restaurants do this, but when you do it, there are certain other rules that come into effect, especially having to do with tip pooling. So tip pooling is generally okay among those employees that typically receive tips. So servers and bussers and bartenders.
Yep.
Right, can all kind of pool their tips and gets distributed out from that. We'll talk about managers a little bit too. Managers can't ever be part of a tip pool, part of the receiving end of a tip pool. Managers can contribute to a tip pool. Is it
because their salary, or is it just because of the status or the title? Because, I mean, that's a big question that's come up with many fast casual, not to cut you off, but a lot of fast casual third key, which are technically managers, but they're third key and they're hourly. I've seen other concepts where they're actually going into this whole tip pool, or they're tipped out because they're technically part of the front of the house. Now, I know from a full service standpoint, that's obviously not the same, but from a fast casual, how does that break down?
So if someone is a manager, or if someone is, an executive in some way, a manager, they are not able to receive anything from a tip pool. And that has to do with the fact, I think the idea behind it is that those people have the ability to influence their subordinate employees and maybe coerce them in some way, right? So that, we want to separate them from that tip pooling arrangement completely. And in fact, whenever a manager is receiving from a tip pool, what the U.S. Department of Labor says is that taints the tip pool entirely, and any of the money that has gone in should really be returned to the servers who pooled their tips. So managers, it's a bad practice to have them in the tip pool ever. Other employees can be in a tip pool, but to get back to the original question, once you take the tip credit, you cannot impose a mandatory tip pooling arrangement that compensates those employees that don't customarily receive tips. So the back of the house, right? So in a traditional tip pooling arrangement, the back of the house isn't included. But in kind of the more modern arrangement, where you want to include the back of the house, you can't impose that as a restaurant owner or manager to your employees for whom you were taking a tip credit for. And this is something I see people get in trouble with all the time. So, that's kind of how it works. So, Um, if you, there is some informal tip pooling arrangements that are not mandated by the restaurant, and those are fine. If a server just wants to tip out the back of the house of their own volition, they are always free to do so. It's once the employer itself gets involved and says you have to do that's what causes.
Yeah. So what's the best way to document tips? And this has also been brought up many times, and I've had this question because, is it better to do it on a spreadsheet? You break it down in terms of hourly, and then the tips are separated that way. Because you have to remember we have a mix of both. We'll talk my restaurant group for a second. A mix of both full service and fast casual. Fast casual is different because the tips go in, then they're calculated out by hourly, and they're paid out. That's one thing. Full service, obviously, bartenders pull the tips together in the bar. There's AM bar, PM bar, and then they split their tips and they figure that out. And servers are individual. So you have different business models going on within one restaurant, right? Because the servers are individual tip entities, and then the bar's a AM, PM bar entity. So what's the best way to document this to make sure that you are compliant, and then you don't lead yourself into some type of lawsuit? So let's talk prevention versus lawsuit,
Sure. So, well, so you've got described kind of some folks that pool their tips and some folks that don't, right? So when, if folks are not pooling their tips, then you're just assigning those tips to that particular employee, on that shift, right? Or I guess whenever, the batches run or whatever.
Exactly, right.
Yeah.
At the end of their
then,
shift or the end of day, whichever.
Yeah. And then, cash tips are a different thing that, employees are required by law to report them. So you should have some mechanism for them to report them to you. That doesn't have to be every day.
That's a tricky one, not to cut you off, because not every server, declares 100% of their tips. I mean, as a full service restaurateur, obviously you tell them, declare your tips at the end when you're doing your payroll reporting. And obviously credit cards, we know, because credit cards tips are easy. They come out of a report. We know what we're paying them and we know what we can declare. But cash tips, at the end of the day, you don't always know what they're getting and what they're putting in their pocket. So you have to, it's almost like that honor system where you have to make sure that they truly are reporting their tips correctly, right?
You do. And for the very small restaurants, this doesn't apply, but for restaurants with I think at least, I might be wrong, but I think it might be 10 regular full-time employees. Then if there isn't 8% of sales reported as tips, then the restaurant's going to have to make up the difference. So it's really in the best interest of the restaurant to make sure that your servers understand that they need to report, at least some. I mean, they're obligated to report them all, but it's kind of out of your hands. So, make sure that they're doing it, I guess, is kind of how that goes. And then as far as documenting the pooled tips, the best, it really depends on how you're dividing things out, right? So some restaurants have a lunch service and a dinner service, for instance, right? So you wouldn't necessarily in that case want to pool all the tips for the same day and then divide it by hours worked in that case. In that case, you would have two different shifts, right? You would have, hours worked on the lunch shift by all employees or all, service employees. And then, tips received and then divide them out that way, and a spreadsheet. A lot of the POS systems, I think, can do this now, to some degree. They're pretty sophisticated nowadays. And then as far as like tipping out your back of the house staff, that usually doesn't happen on the same cadence, right? You may be allocating tips to your servers on a daily basis, but not necessarily to the back of the house staff on that basis. It might be a question of, some percentage is taken away from them, and then at each pay period that is allocated to the different
Yeah.
positions.
So if the back of the house is on salary and they're not hourly, and tips are being paid out in a pooling type atmosphere, does the back of the house get included in that as well? Because that's also another question that goes back and forth. Should the back of the house be truly tipped out as well? Like, what's the law say, as in front of the house versus back of the house?
The law does not require the back of the house to be tipped out ever, right? So that's just a business decision that the individual restaurant has to make. Whether someone's salaried or not, doesn't really matter in terms of that. It what matters a bit has to do with the exemptions, right? So in order to, and maybe we're jumping into that topic now, but
yep, we are. Great segue.
In order to, so some positions some employees are exempt from overtime, from minimum wage and or overtime requirements, and in order to be exempt from those requirements, you generally have to have two things that happen. One is you are paid on a salary basis, meaning you receive a guaranteed amount of salary per week, or per month, or per year, however it's decided. A guaranteed amount. That's the first part, and it has to be greater than $684 per week. That's the current limit. There was a push to raise that a couple of years ago, but that got stayed in litigation, and it's kind of dead for now.
So
that's the first
really
part.
Quickly, when you say $684, obviously that's a salary number. It doesn't get broken down into an hourly number. But how does that work from a state perspective? So for example, if they work 50 hours, is it still $684? Because what I was under the impression, and that's in terms of Maryland law, that they have to make at least a minimum wage times however many hours they work. And then that's how the salary is supposed to be figured out in terms of back of the house. So when you say $684 in terms of exemption, how does that work with the hourly rate mandates and minimums?
So I'm talking about federal law. So this is the Fair Labor Standards Act. So state laws have their own layer on top of this.
Yeah.
But just in terms of federal law, being paid on a salary basis for purposes of an exemption from the Fair Labor Standards Act means that you are paid a certain amount per week, kind of no matter what. But you can do deductions from that for full days missed for certain reasons, but you're kind of guaranteed a weekly amount irrespective of how many hours you work. Now employers can pay someone a salary and not have them be exempt, and still pay them an overtime premium, and still track hours, and still do all of that. But as far as to be exempt from overtime, you have to guarantee that fixed weekly amount of $684 per week, and it can't go up and down every week or anything like that. It has to be kind of a guaranteed amount, minimum amount that can change with the position, or can change with but it's a guaranteed amount that doesn't generally fluctuate. So, but that's the first part. The first part is you have to be paid by salary, enough. The second part, which a lot of people ignore, is the duties test, right? So you have to qualify for a particular exemption under the duties test. Mostly in restaurants, we're talking about the executive or managerial exemption, right? And in order to qualify for that, your employee's primary duty has to be managing either the entire enterprise or a recognized department of the enterprise. They have to have at least 2 full-time equivalent employees working under them. And they have to have either the ability to hire and fire, or their input is given particular weight having to do with hiring and firing decisions. And there's some more intricacies to it than that, but that's basically how it goes. If they're primarily there to cook the food, that then you might have a hard time getting into that exemption. Somebody that a shift lead is an example, right? So you have a bunch of people coming in there. You have 4 line cooks, and one of them you've kind of said you're the shift lead. Well, they're not necessarily the chef or the kitchen manager. They're kind of something else. They most likely would not be able to qualify for that exemption in that case.
Gotcha. So, what do you feel is the largest area of lawsuits when it comes to wage and hour violations? Because, I mean, that's there's a lot of gray to it, even though there's black and white laws. So, where do you come into play when you talk about these lawsuits in regards to wage and hour?
So, from what I see, and this is kind of, there's a few caveats here. When I see an issue with restaurants come up, a lot of times it's during a Department of Labor investigation. Most of those don't proceed to a lawsuit, but during those investigations, it's 3 things: it's tips, minimum wage, and overtime. Child labor gets thrown in there as well, but tips are always a big issue. But as far as things that actually progresses to lawsuit, I see overtime violations all the time. What happens is, it's usually misclassification. Usually we say, this is an exempt employee. The employer doesn't track the hours because they're an exempt employee, doesn't bother to even, collect the records, doesn't track the hours. And then, they work for some period of time and then they leave, maybe not under good terms. And then they bring a lawsuit saying they're owed overtime for all that time work. And the employer is in a bad position because they don't have records either. Right. So they're trying to reconstruct how much this person actually, well, first they're trying to, fight as to whether or not they're exempt. But, a lot of times it turns out that they're not. And then, the employee's word is going to be given a lot of weight there, right? I say I worked this amount, they don't have a record, prove me wrong. So I do see a lot of those sorts of things. Most of the other stuff usually gets resolved at the administrative level, but not always.
Yeah. You actually just answered my next question is, as owners, what should you audit on a daily basis? I guess keep great records in terms of what people work, especially, and nowadays, like you said, a POS, they should be clocking in and out anyway. They shouldn't be working off the clock. So you should be able to go back like Toast, and a lot of these POS systems actually keep great record keeping and great timekeeping. So if they're really doing what they should, you should have the ability to audit that information on a daily basis or yearly basis or however long is needed for any type of dispute.
Yeah, and I would ask even your exempt employees, even your managers, I'd ask them to clock in and out. I've seen some of these disputes before where your sous chef just clocking in at the beginning of his first shift of the week and clocking out at the end of the week. So they're clocked in the whole time. Well, I'm pretty sure you didn't work 120 hours this week, but, so yeah, the systems are great. Just make sure that people are trained to use them properly because you're going to have all the records you need then. And then when the Department of Labor comes calling, it's really easy. It's, one button, download the file. Here you go. Take a look.
Yeah. It's also good for, and we preach this on every store: clock in, clock out, clock in, clock out. Because the problem is, if God forbid they're hurt or something happens and they're not working and they're not on the clock or they forget to clock in, that's an insurance nightmare. Because the first thing in insurance, workman's comp, the first thing they ask is, send me the employee records where they were showing that they were actually in the restaurant working. We actually have had problems where, they forgot to clock in or they fell. I mean, we had one restaurant, this was years ago. I think it was almost 15 years ago. She's a bartender and she literally was standing up on one of those ladders to reach a high bottle and she fell and the bottle came down and literally cut open her wrist. And I mean, she had to have surgeries and it went on for a long time. And if, we didn't have the workman's comp or we didn't have show that she was actually on the clock. And I mean, that's a whole nother nightmare, So it's important to protect your employees and yourself if everybody follows the system.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's jump into employee complaints, because I know you handle a lot of different areas of employment law when it comes to restaurants. And I'm sure you see this a lot with harassment, discrimination. Um, there's the list probably goes on and on and on and on. But talk about some of the, I guess, areas that restaurateurs can protect themselves on this level so there's not lawsuits brought against them. And that goes back to, like I said earlier, prevention versus litigation and liability.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, you should have, all business owners should have a process for handling employee complaints, right? And, this is something that's going to go in your employee handbook. If you don't have a handbook, you should, but if you don't, you have it somewhere, and you have it available for the employee and for your managers to know what to do in that situation, right? So who what is the complaint process? Who do they go to? Who do they bring a complaint to? What do you do if the complaint involves the person that you generally would bring the complaint to? Right? So you have to have some alternate reporting,
which happens a lot in the restaurant business.
Yeah, because it's usually make the complaint to your supervisor. Well, a lot of time it's the supervisor that we're complaining about. So have some way to handle that. Have thought about that. And then, a process for dealing with the complaint. And usually what this means is an investigative process, right? So, whoever gets the complaint is going to initiate some sort of investigation into it. Depending on the complaint, it might be something really informal, just talking to a couple of folks. It might be something more detailed, like even bringing in an outside investigator if that complaint involves one of your high-level leaders, for instance. And then it should have some sort of resolution process. So what's going to happen afterward? So, we are going to, engage in discipline or, discipline the employee, determine what we're going to do with that. Is the complainant going to know what happened? Are you going to tell the complainant that it's been resolved, or what's going to happen with that? So
is there some type of liability that they have to tell the complaint that it's been handled? Because I mean, that's also a gray area, right? Because I mean, obviously how you handle things in your restaurant doesn't always have to be communicated 100% to the person complaining. I mean, obviously you want to tell them it's been resolved, but do you have to go into detail about what type of resolution occurred, or what's the rule there?
Yeah, I mean, generally not, but I think you're right. You should tell them that it's been resolved, because the problem is if you don't share the information, then you have a vacuum there. And what's going to go into that vacuum? That employee is going to start thinking, my complaints are not even addressed. They didn't, they're discriminating against me. They're retaliating against me for making a complaint or something to that effect, right? So, and here's the other reason why you need a complaint process. So if there ever is a lawsuit brought, a claim brought against you, a discrimination claim under, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, or under the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, or kind of a number of other laws, you have this thing called so it's a Farragher-Ellerth defense that's based on some Supreme Court cases. And that basically says the defense available to the employer that says, look, we had this process available to the employee where they could have resolved this problem, and they failed to use that process, and therefore we are not necessarily liable for what actually occurred. So once you have that process in place, the onus is on the employee to use the process so that you can deal with these problems. And if they don't do so, that's a good defense for you.
Interesting. So what happens on a franchise piece? So, the franchisor and the franchisee, right? Obviously, the franchisor can't get involved in every franchisee issue or litigation. However, what's the franchisor's legal right or responsibility if there is an employee having a problem with a franchisee? Because at the end of the day, really, they should be bringing it up, bubbling it up to the franchisee, the owner of the franchisee. They should have a policy. They should investigate. So what happens, because we're talking restaurants now. So full service, obviously, there's a whole process. You have HR, you have your step-by-step employee handbooks, documentation, blah, blah, blah. But what happens when it's a larger company and now you're dealing with fast casual in a franchisor model?
So the first question to answer is who's the employer, right? So generally that's going to be the franchisee. But if you have a situation where the franchisor has a lot of control over the individual employment decisions of the franchisee, that might be kind of a gray area. And if you are the employer, then you are responsible for the actions that you take regarding that employee. So it's interesting because I've seen situations where, where a franchisee is just kind of like, well, this is kind of how it's done. And they don't really even think about the fact that something might be illegal, some practice they're engaged in might be illegal, right? Because they feel like they have this umbrella of this larger organization that's in some way protecting them. Well, bad practices can propagate through that organization, just like they can through any organization. So that's, it's not like that there's any particular protection that you're going to get from being in that organization. I think it's going to be pretty individualized, and franchisees have an obligation to make sure that they're doing things correctly, because generally it's going to fall on them unless there are specific facts saying that it's not.
Yeah, there's such a gray area when it comes to the franchisor and the franchisee because, it's truly their business. They make all the decisions. I mean, obviously, as the franchisor, you say, this is what you should be doing. This is the training you should be following. These are the systems you should be using. But not every franchisee follows those systems. And, then when something happens, they're like, well, what should I do? And they call the franchisor, and the first thing we ask is the same thing that you just said. Where's your HR manual? Where's your documentation? Where's your audit? And if they don't have it, it's a hard place to start, because you kind of have to go back and scramble. And I mean, not everybody follows the system,
right?
Unfortunately. Right?
Yeah, unfortunately.
I'm sure you see that all the time.
I do.
I probably just asked all the questions you asked. Where's your operations book? Where's your employee handbook? Where's your performance logs? I mean, it's a standard process, but to get everybody to follow it sometimes is the hardest part.
Absolutely. It is.
Yeah. So for anybody listening right now, I mean, obviously we covered a lot in a short amount of time. I mean, in terms of wage and labor, overtime, tip credits, child labor laws is a whole nother show. I mean, what's your restaurants who are listening right now? If they hang up and they go back into the restaurant, what are some tips for them to go back and do some high level audit and checks to make sure that they are compliant with what we discussed today, which could lead into a big problem if they're not compliant?
Well, I mean, this is kind of something I preach all the time, but, get a handbook, right? Get policies in place. The first question, if you don't have that, stop and get it. Either contact an employment attorney or, an HR consultant or, I hesitate to advise anyone to use AI, but a lot of people do. Find something, a handbook in place, make sure you read and understand it and are prepared to follow those policies, because we talked about the reporting process for complaints. That's the most important thing that's going to go into that handbook. There's going to be a lot of other stuff in there too that is going to be knowledge that your employees have on what the rules are of my employment, of my job. But it's also going to be a roadmap for your supervisors and your managers on how to do the things, how to answer those difficult questions and how to deal with those difficult problems. So that's the first thing that I would do. I would also, if you have exempt employees, you're going to want to make sure that they are passing both the salary basis and the duties tests. The Department of Labor, the U.S. Department of Labor has these great fact sheets that are available to anyone. Just get on the website. If you have a question, type it in. They probably answered it a million times already. Download those, read those, make sure you understand those. And then documentation. There's the certain documents that you have to have, records that you need to keep for 3 years, usually having to do with wage and hour stuff. Make sure you have them. If you don't have them, do your best to recreate whatever records you don't have, and make sure going forward that you're keeping all that information.
So you said, so that was my next question. How long should employee records be kept? You said 3 years.
Generally for 3 years under the Fair Labor Standards Act. The statute of limitation under that act is 2 years, and then 3 years for any willful violations. But generally, pretty much everything is found to be willful because employers are expected to know what the law is. So there are very few times where an employee or where the Department of Labor won't be able to go back 3 years into.
Does it have to be actual like paper documents, or can it also be electronic?
No, it definitely can be electronic. In fact, electronic is the best way to go. You can back it up in multiple places, and not have all those banker's boxes that you never open again.
I know, right? And then it's going to shred all this stuff. I mean, I'm such a paper person. And then when you go to move an office, you're like, oh my God, where do we have all this paper? So, well, Doug, you're never going to believe it. We're at 40 minutes. We made it through. We didn't glitch. We had volume. We had a microphone. So we were very successful in filming the show today. So that's good news. But before you go, at the end of every show, I always do rapid fire kind of quick lightning round questions. They're just quick, meant to be 1 or 2 minutes just to kind of pick your brain on a couple key topics. So I'm going to throw them out to you and let's start there. So text messages, are they legal evidence or not?
Absolutely.
That's a good one to know, because I've heard from other people that, you can't use a text message, but it's documentation today, right? Everything.
It's
email or text.
They're hard to get because you can't, they get deleted and they aren't necessarily saved on some server somewhere, but they are evidence. They're evidence, the same way a conversation is, a in-person conversation is evidence. It's just, in that case, you have to rely on somebody's recollection, which is not as reliable. A text message is written. It's a writing. It's good evidence. It's generally admissible.
What about social media? What if something shows up on an employee's social media that incriminates them to something they did while they were in your restaurant?
If you know about it, you're going to want to act on that. That's absolutely, in the modern world, pretty much everything is fair game.
Okay, good to know. So if an employer monitors an employee's social media, then it's technically evidence.
Yes.
Okay. What's the biggest employment law myth?
Regarding restaurants, I'm going to have to say it's if everyone does it, I'm not going to get in trouble for it because I've seen that over and over again. I mean, I'm definitely want to get restaurant owners to handle tips better, but I've seen where 90% of them are doing it wrong and they think they're not going to get in trouble for that. The Department of Labor doesn't care. They're going to show up if they get a complaint, and you're going to get investigated and you'll be found liable, regardless of how many other people are.
All right. So let's test your restaurant background, catering, chef. What's your favorite meal to cook?
Well, it's summertime right now, so it's whatever's fresh that I can put on the grill, actually, vegetables out of my garden, and maybe a nice piece of grilled fish. I mean, that's that and a nice glass of wine and I'm set.
Nice. All right. Well, for everybody listening, you know where to find me. DMs are always open. You can go to LinkedIn, restaurantdiva.com. We now have a great website for dineanddishpodcast.com. And Doug, for anybody listening, where can they find you if they have any questions in regards to employment law or wage and labor issues? Is there a website or a phone number that they should call or email?
Yeah. So our website here at Idaho Employment Lawyers is www.idemploymentlawyers.com. And that's a good place. You can get links to other things. I also have a podcast that we
nice.
do here.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, we have a podcast that we do here that I'm a contributor of. It's called Ground Rules, Employment Law Over Your Coffee Break. So you can go ahead and look that up online. And we published a book. We have our Law for Leaders book that I'm a contributing author on as well. So all those are good places to get information and to find out.
Actually, you just answered another question. I was actually going to ask you coffee or espresso, but you just said coffee.
Well, I mean, what I truly like is a very short Americano, but, I'll take what I can get.
And what would you want to leave everybody with today? If you can give one piece of advice to every restaurant owner that's watching the show, what would that be?
I think it would be make a plan, like pause and think things through before you act. I think when we're in the restaurant industry, it's go, go, go. It's like, let's deal with the immediate problem today. But I think if everybody took a minute to think about what systems I need to get into place, what help do I need to marshal in order to answer this problem, just pause and be a little more thoughtful. I think you'll do just fine.
Yeah. Well, for everybody listening, you heard it from Doug, you heard it from me. Restaurants are not just there to entertain and experience. You need to have great systems. I say it all the time. Without systems, there's chaos and you need to be compliant. I know everybody hates paperwork and they hate numbers and they hate keeping books. And, restaurateurs are like artists. They're kind of all over the place, but you got to kind of herd things back and create a culture and environment that's safe and happy for everybody to work in. And you don't want to have lawsuits and waste money on things that you don't need to waste money on, and put your money in your pocket and build other restaurants and create happy people. Right, Doug?
Absolutely.
So it's not good for your business, but it's good for our business.
I mean, we spend a lot of time trying to deal with problems on the front end. I don't like lawsuits any more than the people that are getting sued. I don't want to be doing litigation. I'd much rather be going out and doing training and helping people do things right.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being a guest. We got it to work, and I'd love to have you back in a future show, and maybe we'll do something with your podcast.
Sounds great.
Yeah, but thank you again. And for everybody listening, that's another episode of Dine and Dish, and we'll be back next week with another great topic. Thanks. Bye, Doug. Thank you.